Hello and welcome to Lesson 6. We're halfway through the quarter, which is why this is called Lesson 6. We did not do a lesson for Lesson 5 because you had your final drafts of your first major writing project due. However, I think things would just be simpler if the number of the lesson corresponds to the module that we're in. So this is Lesson 6, and it represents the start of the second half of the quarter. What I'm actually going to do in this lesson is introduce you to your second and final major writing project. Now you might be thinking, why am I introducing you to a project that's not due for 5 weeks? Well, as we learned in the last few lessons where we talked about the writing process, great writing takes planning, doing multiple drafts ahead of time so that you can revise those drafts. And in that sense, the earlier you start on a paper, the better. So the first 3 weeks of the quarter were introductory material. The last 2 weeks, we focused on your first major writing project. The remainder of the quarter will focus on your second and final major writing project. So everything you do from this point forward will be steps that help you work toward doing the final draft of this project. That way, everything we're doing in the course is useful to you, and we'll talk about how this project and what you learn in it will be useful beyond the course. So the lesson is appropriately titled, How to Research and Analyze Pop Culture, because that's what I'm asking you to do in the assignment. First, we'll take a look at the assignment prompt. So this portion of the lecture will be very similar to the first part of actually the last lecture you watched, where I went over the assignment prompt for the first major paper, the rhetorical analysis, in detail. We'll do that again here so that for the rest of the quarter, you have this project in the back of your mind and all the things you do for the class can be working toward it. Next, we'll look at an example of this kind of analysis. If it's called research analysis of a cultural artifact, you're asking what that is. I'm going to tell you what that is in part 1. Part 2, we're going to look at an example. Now, we already read the piece, Just One More Game, but it's actually a great example of a research analysis of a cultural artifact. So in the reading homework, you could just skim this piece because you've already read it. But here, we'll see how it really illustrates the kind of project I'm looking for you to do. Finally, we'll take a look at a second example because 2 examples are better than 1. Really, anytime you're doing some kind of complex writing project, the more examples you see, the better. And so these will not be the last 2 examples we look at, but these are the first 2 I'm going to use to introduce you to the project. And so one of them you've read before, the other you haven't, but they both, again, illustrate the kind of research analysis that comments on popular culture and on our culture and our society that I'm looking for you to do in the paper. One question you might have would be, why study popular culture? Well, they call it popular or pop culture because it's what is popular at a given cultural moment. So if you take a piece of that popular culture, say a film, a show, a book, a comic book, a video game, what have you, and you analyze that piece, you're gaining some understanding of the culture and the society it comes from. So in that sense, these popular texts become what we call cultural artifacts. And so when you analyze that piece, you're then able to make commentary, make claims about that culture, about the issues in that culture. So in a class like English 101, we talk about the major societal issues, and we try to come up with creative ideas, creative solutions for approaching them, but that can become old very quickly. So the cultural artifact gives us a new way of doing that. If we talk about what a movie or a show teaches us about our culture, we find new and really productive ways of engaging with the social issues. that's the reason for this assignment. I'm hoping it'll be fun. I'm hoping analyzing a cultural artifact will give you a new way and a more engaging, more interesting way to talk about societal issues. But it may be a process you're not too familiar with. So we're going to go over how to do it now. The most basic statement of the task of what I'm asking you to do in the simplest terms is this. Take a clear stance on an important real-world issue and analyze a cultural artifact of your choice as evidence to prove your argument. So let's take a couple minutes and parse this statement out phrase by phrase. It's not a long sentence, but there's 2 or 3 important things here to get from this. So the first clause or statement is take a clear stance on an important real-world issue. So one layer to the paper is clearly this real-world issue, something going on in our world, our culture, our society that is complicated and there's diverse opinions about. You need to enter into that and take a stance. So 2 things are clear from this first statement. One is you're talking about a real-world issue, and 2, you need to take a stance on it. That means make an argument about it. So that would be the thesis of your paper. So there's all kinds of issues you can talk about. I mean, global warming is often a popular one people like to write about. All kinds of different things have happened with the coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent things that have happened since then that have, to a certain extent, been caused by it. So lots of real-world issues to consider, but remember, it's not just talking about it, it's making an argument about it. The next clause says, and analyze a cultural artifact. So you've got an argument about a real-world issue, and then you've got a cultural artifact, this text from popular culture. What are you going to do with that? You're going to analyze it, right? So in each of these phrases, we have something and then what you're supposed to do with it. So a real-world issue, make an argument about it. A cultural artifact, analyze it. What does it mean to analyze something? You've done a rhetorical analysis. You've got some analytical work under your belt. But what would be a quick way of saying that or summing up what analysis is? The last clause of the sentence tells us that as evidence to prove your argument. So when you have an argument, a thesis statement in a paper, you then go into your body paragraphs and you analyze examples and you explain how. You say, this example shows us this, and that tells us that my argument is indeed true. You don't use that exact phrasing, but that's in essence what you're doing in an argumentative paper or persuasive paper. Here in this paper, the evidence you're using, because there's all different kinds of evidence you could use, is the cultural artifact. So that's what makes it a pop culture type of analysis. So it's really quite simple. I have more instructions for you, but we don't need to overcomplicate it. You make an argument about an issue, and your evidence to prove that issue is the text. So you got to analyze that text and explain how the content of that text shows that your thesis is true and that readers should believe it. That's how you create change in your readers' minds with this particular assignment. Now, the last really important piece of information here is that you can choose almost any text you want. For example, novel, film, show, comic book, video game, etc. You'll notice those instructions are very similar to the first assignment, the rhetorical analysis. That's intentional on my part. I think it's really important that we study and analyze these pop culture texts because they teach us so much about the world we live in, and in talking about them, they give us ways to engage with that culture and comment back, make our own arguments and assertions about what's going on in the world. So that's why we're doing it twice. But the first time, you were looking at how that text was constructed, how the author composed it to try to give us a message. The second time, you're looking at a text and you're saying, what does this message communicate and why is it important? So you're making an important shift from studying how texts are made to really creating your own text and communicating your message to the world using analysis as your tool to do that. Now, those are two very different goals, even though you're working with the same type of text. So you may definitely want to write on a different text, and you certainly can and should do that. Some of you may be really passionate about what you wrote on for the rhetorical analysis and want to use that text again. That's totally fine, but this has to be a brand new paper. You cannot recycle parts of your first paper. And again, what you're saying about that text is very different, because instead of looking at how it's constructed, you're looking at how its meaning or its message supports a stance you're taking about a real world issue. So as long as you don't recycle the first paper, you can write on the same text. There's obviously advantages and disadvantages to doing the same text as well as to doing a different text. So it really comes down to your argument, your topic, what you want to write about. And if you have any questions about what text to choose, just shoot me an email and we'll figure it out. So to sum up, there's two parts to this paper. The real world issue, you make an argument about that. The cultural artifact, you analyze that as the means of proving your argument. With every paper, I have that purpose statement where I go into the skills and knowledge you gain by doing the assignment to give the reason why we're doing the assignment, so that I'm transparent, so that you know there's a real, legitimate, helpful rationale for what we're doing, and we're not just doing it because the professor has asked us to do it. I talked about that as part of my philosophy in detail in the last lecture, but let's look at this particular assignment and see what we get from it in terms of skills and knowledge, so we know why we're doing it. The knowledge here is really rhetorical knowledge. As I said a minute ago, at this point in the quarter, we make the shift from studying others' rhetorical strategies to developing our own rhetorical strategies. This is really important. You studied and made an argument about how a text was composed and created by its authors and whether that was effective or not a couple weeks ago. Now you're making your own argument, putting your argument, your voice out into the world. So this is a really important piece of rhetorical knowledge. And that will help you in all kinds of situations, because we're constantly making arguments, whether it's something simple about, what place to eat lunch, or whether it's a bigger life decision, maybe what car to buy, or maybe it's something really important where you have to persuade someone, like, hire me for this job. Learning how to make arguments, use rhetorical strategies to make them convincingly and to put those opinions out into the world in front of your employers, your friends, your family, etc. There might be nothing more important you could learn in college. So we need this rhetorical knowledge, but that's a theory. What are the skills we use to put that knowledge into practice? One is argument. Like I said before, we write to create change. Perhaps persuade people to think differently about a real-world issue. That's what we're doing in this paper as a practice for persuading people to think differently about other things. Maybe you are applying for a job, and the employer doesn't necessarily think you're the right person for the job. If you write a really convincing and persuasive argument, you create change. That employer goes from thinking you're not the best fit to this job to, we gotta hire this person. And you need rhetorical strategies to be able to do that. So argument would be one of the skills you learn here. You learn how to make effective arguments so you can put this rhetorical knowledge into practice. Another one is the analysis of evidence. So these are like the two pieces, right? You're making an argument about the real world issue, and you're analyzing the cultural artifact as evidence to prove your argument. And this is just another important skill in this process of learning to hone rhetorical strategies, because you have an argument, you have to have support for it. If your argument is, I'm the best fit for this job, I'm going to make your company better, someone's going to ask why, and you say, these are the reasons, X, Y, and Z, because I'm great at interacting with others, I have a strong work ethic, and I have great time management. Okay, those are the reasons why. Show me that, prove that. Well, I've done this when I worked here. I've done this when I worked there. These examples show that I'm qualified. So that's how you could take these skills and put them into practice in the real world. For this paper, you're doing something similar. You say, this is what I believe is true about issue X. Here's this movie or this film that shows what I'm saying. Here's 3 examples from it. Here's how example 1 shows what I'm saying is true. Here's how example 2 shows what I'm saying is true. So on and so forth. There's another important piece of this paper that we haven't talked about yet, and it's a really important skill, which is research. Because I called it a research analysis, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means you have to find not just the cultural artifact, but other types of sources to support your argument. Why? Well, earlier in the quarter, when we were studying critical reading, we talked about the importance of bringing other voices to the discussion. So you have your analysis of the cultural artifact, but what do other people think about this issue and this artifact? So bringing other sources into the paper and engaging with those voices can help you make your argument more well-rounded, show that there's a lot of evidence to back up what you're saying and that you're not just making things up. What types of sources do you need to find? There's what we call a primary source, and these are important terms to learn that'll help you in other college classes. So it's the cultural artifact you analyze. So it's when you do a pop culture analysis, you engage with more than one type of source, because while the cultural artifact is evidence to prove your argument, it's your primary evidence. The bulk of your paper focuses on it. So we call that a primary source. But you have those other voices too that kind of round out, flesh out the argument, but aren't as important as the artifact. So call those secondary sources, additional sources for context and support. And so you need a few of these as well. But there's all different kinds of secondary sources. So 2 important distinctions to remember: primary source, the main thing, the main focus you're analyzing; secondary source, other pieces of research that give context and support. But what are some types of secondary sources? There's scholarly sources, which are peer-reviewed and found through the library. You're probably familiar with scholarly sources from when you've done projects before. Research projects, before, for other classes or in high school. But there's also something called popular sources, which are web articles about popular culture. So the 2 examples we're going to look at in the second half of the lecture are popular sources. They're not scholarly sources. And most of the time you'll find that professors will ask you for your secondary sources to be scholarly sources. So you need to get some practice with that, and you will hear, and you'll get even more when you take English 201. But I used to just require only scholarly sources in 101. And while that would prepare you well for your other college classes, and that's an important part of this class, it doesn't prepare you well for the real world. Because as much as scholarly sources are sometimes important in the real world, you're going to encounter popular sources more often, both in what you read for your own entertainment and interest, as well as even for making and supporting arguments, even for things like a research project for a company. Popular sources are published faster and quicker, and they're not necessarily unreliable. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So this paper, you're allowed to use both, and you need to have at least 3 total. But whether those are, more of them are scholarly or more of them are popular, that's up to you, as long as you have some of each and you have 3 total. So 4 total if you count the primary plus the 3 secondary, any mix of scholarly and popular among the secondary, as long as you have both. The one last note I'll make here, well, two things. One thing is, should the sources be on the real-world issue or the cultural artifact? Your choice. Mix that up however you want. They can all be on the issue. They can all be on the artifact. They can be a mixture of both. Your choice. The thing I'll say is it's probably going to be easier to find scholarly sources on the issue and easier to find popular sources on the artifact. In some cases, because everyone's going to be probably writing on something pretty different, that might vary, but generally that'll be true. So again, mix that up however you want. Some of your cultural artifacts will be so new that you won't find any sources, not even popular ones on them, and that's fine. You can just find sources on the real world issue in that case. Or you can find popular sources on other types of texts from that genre. Maybe you're writing about a science fiction movie that's brand new. You could find sources about other science fiction movies just to kind of illustrate your overall point. But that's something we could talk about in more detail if you have questions. So if you have trouble finding sources or questions, seek me out, but Lesson 7 will be entirely devoted to teaching you how to find sources, the lesson we do next week. Finally, my last point here is these sources have to be credible sources. So you can't use blogs or social media posts like you used for the rhetorical analysis. That is one limitation here. And they have to be credible and reliable because there's a lot of popular sources out there, like the two I'm going to show you in a few minutes here, that are really good sources. But there's also popular sources that are not good. So one of the really important things about studying popular sources and using them in your papers is it requires you to learn how to analyze and determine for yourself if something is credible. Scholarly sources are, for the most part, in a sense, automatically credible because they've already been reviewed by people before they're published. And so if we just stuck with scholarly sources like we used to do in 101, you wouldn't learn how to discern the credibility of something. But with the proliferation of fake news and unreliable information online, we need to learn how to be discerning. And determining the credibility and reliability of a source will help you do that. So as you look for sources, when you find the popular ones, you need to take some time, engage with them, and determine, is this credible? In Lesson 8, we'll be devoted to teaching you how to do that and asking you to do it for your discussion board post in Lesson 8. Finally, the last skill we're going to talk about before we move on is synthesis. So what is synthesis? You've got argument, analysis, research, now synthesis for the 4 skills you're learning for this project. Synthesis is making connections. So on the assignment prompt, I ask you to find the connections between the sources. What do they all have in common? And then I also ask you to find connections between the sources and your argument. How does your argument fit into the conversation? So think of it like this. You've got these 3 secondary sources. They're talking about the real world issue. They're talking about the artifact. They're having a conversation with each other. If synthesis is just a fancy way of making connections, you've got to make connections. What is source 1 saying that is similar to what source B is saying? What are they both saying that is similar to or different from what source C is saying? Synthesize them together. Bring them together. A lot of times you read research papers and people talk about sources one at a time. That's not very helpful. Synthesis is talking about the sources all at the same time. Be another way of saying that. Finally, there's a 4th piece that's part of this conversation, and that's your argument. If you look at the similarities between source A and B and the similarities of those 2 sources with source C, you've brought them all into the paper because they're related to what you're saying. So also look at the similarities of what those 3 arguments are saying together and what your argument is saying. And they're all a little distinct, right? None of them are saying exactly the same thing. Similarly, you should not be saying exactly the same thing, because that would make your paper redundant. Your argument needs to be somewhat unique. A question you should ask yourself is, how do I add something to this conversation? How do I throw a new idea into the mix? What of these other three sources overlooked? And so really the point of bringing secondary sources, of bringing research into a paper, is not just to back up what you say, although they can do that. It's more so to show that you have a unique, original idea. People reading your paper have not done the research you've done, and you can really show how impressive your idea is and create change, make your readers into believers by showing, this is a new idea I've come up with that will solve this problem or help in some way no one else has thought of before. And so that's why we bring research into our argumentative and analysis papers, and that's why we synthesize it. We bring the sources together, then we bring our own argument to bear on their conversation and say, what about this idea I've come up with? So argument, analysis, research, and synthesis to show the uniqueness of your argument. Now, not necessarily in that order. One last question you probably have is, where do I synthesize the sources in the paper? I would say after your intro, before you analyze the artifact, so you clear that ground and that the majority of the paper is just you engaging with the artifact, really driving your argument home. You don't want to make this very compelling argument by analyzing the source in depth and then throwing all your research in at the end of the paper. That would just give readers too much to think about when you should be wrapping up your argument. But if you clear that ground first and then analyze the artifact in depth, you will have a persuasive argument. Now, I'm not saying you have to do it that way, because you may be writing and it may be more organic to include the sources at different points. So whatever seems to make the most sense, do that. But that's just kind of a general ground rule I wanted to give you, since a lot of you are probably wondering, where do I put the sources? So that's my summary of what to do for the paper. Again, you're making an argument about a real-world issue. You're bringing some research in to show how your argument is unique, and then you're analyzing a text from popular culture to prove your argument. Those are the three pieces in sequence for the most part. Lesson 4, when we went over the rhetorical analysis, I also went over kind of the fundamental requirements, length of the paper, etc. That's all pretty straightforward. That's just on the assignment sheets on Canvas. So if you have any questions about that, shoot me an email. But let's look at some examples. So we read Just One More Game way back in, I think, lesson 2. How is this an example of a research analysis of a cultural artifact? His argument says, I worry about the dystopic potential of gamification. Instead of just bombarding us with jingles, corporations will be able to inject their messages directly into our minds with ads disguised as games. This is not, I would say, the main point of his argument, but it's where he makes an argument about culture and analyzes cultural artifacts to prove it. So he talked about gamification, which is basically the commodification of games, or turning games into a way to make money, which video games, from the time, people put a quarter in an arcade machine, have always been a way to make money. But with the proliferation of gaming on smartphones, it's been taken to a new level where we see ads constantly as we're playing smartphone games. And as he argued in his piece, they're very addictive. And so companies have always tried to sell us and market us things, but there's a new game in town, gamification, that just takes that to a whole new level. And so he's showing us this, illustrating this to us, and pointing it out as something to be perhaps, concerned about, to at least approach with a heavy dose of skepticism, and to at least think about how much we play games and to be really intentional about that. I would say, is his argument. But how is this argument, now that we've explained what it is, how is it a researched analysis of popular culture? Well, you have the cultural artifacts, which are stupid games. So I'm asking you to mainly focus on one artifact in your paper because I want you to do really in-depth analysis, and he does in-depth analysis, but your paper is much shorter than his article. So focusing on one text will be most beneficial to you. There might be some situations, depending on your topic, where you could write on multiple texts. If that's something you really want to pursue, send me an email and run your idea by me. I'll probably say yes, but you and I should talk about it first, at least via email. So two most prominent examples are probably Tetris, which is an older stupid game, and then Angry Birds, but really the entire genre of stupid games are his cultural artifacts because he talks about a lot of games. And then his real world issue are the proliferation of stupid games and gamification. They really work together because his main point is that these games are ubiquitous. With smartphones now, everyone plays them. And why is that important? I mean, he argues that games are important. They can help us. Play is good, but they're addicting. And they're everywhere now. So we need to be careful and intentional. And a reason for that is gamification. People are going to be making money off us. Perhaps you could even say exploiting us. So he talks about a cultural artifact, stupid games, and he engages real world issues, how people market and manipulate us through advertising. So hopefully that's really clear how this is like a researched analysis of a cultural artifact. One example you're very familiar with. Let's look at another example you're not as familiar with. So this is an article not on the most recent Halloween movie, but the one before it. I myself am not a huge fan of the horror genre. I came across this article and it's like, oh, this really clearly, perfectly illustrates a research analysis of popular culture. And I know the horror genre is really popular. So instead of just talking about things I like superhero movies, here's a chance for us to talk about something that probably a lot of people in the class like. So how does this article address the prompt for our assignment? Here's the author's thesis. And when he says both, he's talking about two movies, the second most recent Halloween movie and The Haunting of Hill House. And he says both movies focus on mental illness and inherited trauma, as well as mothers so consumed with worry about their children's safety that they wind up separated or estranged from them. So the cultural artifacts are really obviously Halloween and The Haunting of Hill House. And again, it's a longer piece than you're writing, so analyzing two pieces makes sense. But one of the things I like about this piece is, in contrast to the stupid games piece, you see a really in-depth analysis, two in-depth analyses, one of Halloween, one of The Haunting of Hill House. But if you just look at how he or she, the author, analyzes one of these texts in depth, you'll get kind of an example, kind of an idea of what I'm asking you to do. So those are the artifacts. The real world issue is how parents worry about their children. And as a father of 5 children, I really worry about my children a lot. But what are the effects of this? And so obviously a very important real world social issue here. Really getting into the psychology of it and the mental health of it. So a very important piece. Another reason I like this piece is you can really see clearly how it's very important what it's talking about, yet it's using something people probably don't typically think of as important, horror movies, to make that argument. And you see how, even though these are pop culture texts, they convey the author's argument. Obviously, we should be worried about our children's safety, and we should take steps to ensure their safety, but we can worry about it to a point that we actually end up alienating our children. We could be so controlling potentially that we drive them away and we're separated or estranged. And that's the argument the author makes, is we have to find a balance, right? Caring for our children, but not in a way that pushes them away. And even though the danger is real in these movies because they're horror movies, you do see that effect of pushing too hard for our children's safety. So a really interesting and important argument, but illustrated by a horror movie. Because you could say if we push too hard and we're too controlling, we might push away the people we're trying to protect. And you can make that argument. But is it convincing? Seeing it play out in a horror movie where the danger is real, but perhaps there's a greater danger of losing the connection to one's child, you see it illustrated. And seeing it, visualizing like that, drives the argument home and makes the truth of it real to readers in a very convincing way. Much less so, or much more so, than just saying the argument and maybe quoting some statistics. So hopefully this piece and the other Stupid Games piece, hopefully they both show you why this kind of cultural analysis is really relevant, important, and helpful, how it can help you create change, and how it can help you voice the opinion you want to voice, but in a new and creative way. I think this assignment will be fun. I really look forward to reading yours eventually and seeing what you come up with. The next lesson, we'll talk about research and how to do that, and each lesson will build up to the piece. Your discussion board for this one is to basically start brainstorming. You're not locked into the ideas you put in your discussion board post. You can change at any point, but at least start thinking about what you want to do for the assignment. And of course, as you're thinking about it, reach out to me with any questions you might have.